The phone buzzed insistently in my pocket, pulling me out of the fog of focus I had desperately tried to maintain. I had been sitting in the small, dusty clinic for what seemed like hours, wrapped up in the soothing rhythm of the village air. It was a quiet place, one of those rural towns where life moved slowly and people came to heal, not escape. Yet, that was exactly what I had been trying to do, escape. Escape from the chaos of my life, the never-ending barrage of work, the endless cycle of disappointments. I needed to feel something other than the exhaustion that clung to me like a second skin. I wiped my forehead, feeling the hot afternoon sun blazing overhead. My body slick with sweat as I stepped outside the small clinic. The sharp sting of the sunlight caught me off guard as I adjusted to the heat. I had been so caught up in my own thoughts, trying to push aside the weight that had been pressing down on me for months, that I hadn't noticed the world moving around me. The village was picturesque, charming even, but the serenity that seemed to wrap around everything here only made my unease more pronounced. I glanced down at my phone, the name flashing across the screen, pulling me back into the reality I had been trying so desperately to escape. Carl Davis. My stomach sank, a familiar knot tightening in my gut. Carl. That name had haunted me for years. He was my stepfather, if you could even call him that, who had wormed his way into our family when I was just 15. My mom had married him after my father left, hoping to fill the void that had been left in our lives. But Carl had never been the father figure I had wanted, and the moment he had entered our home, I had known my life would never be the same. Carl was charming, smooth with his words, and capable of making people believe whatever he wanted them to. But beneath the surface, he was selfish, manipulative, and always willing to take advantage of any situation that suited him. Our relationship had never been easy. Years of dealing with his constant drama, his schemes, his insatiable need for control, it had worn me down. But this call I knew wasn't going to be different. He was never one to call just to check in or offer words of encouragement. His calls always came with some new disaster he had created or some mess he needed me to clean up. I almost didn't answer. Part of me wanted to throw the phone away, to leave him to his own devices and pretend like he didn't exist. But something in me, maybe curiosity, maybe that faint, stupid hope that perhaps this time he might surprise me, forced me to swipe the screen and answer. "Hey Daisy." Carl's voice came through, annoyingly cheerful. Too cheerful. I hadn't heard him sound like this in years, and I immediately felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was the kind of tone he used when he was hiding something, when he thought he could get away with something and was just waiting to see how I'd react. "Just thought you should know, I sold the cabin." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I froze. My hand tightened around the phone, my mind scrambling to process what I had just heard. He couldn't have said what I thought he said. My breath caught in my chest, and for a split second, I couldn't even speak. "You did what?" I managed to croak out, my voice shaking with disbelief. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the familiar rush of anger and betrayal rising within me. There was no way he could have just done that. It wasn't his to sell. It wasn't his to decide. He had no right. Carl's response was casual, too casual, as if what he had done was no different than any other mundane decision. "Yeah, sold it. Had to. Needed the cash to clear up some debts. It's done. It's done." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I couldn't find my voice. The cabin was more than just a building to me. It was my refuge, a sanctuary, a place I had built with my own hands after years of pouring my heart and soul into it. It had been my escape from the world, from the relentless pressure of my career, from the crushing weight of disappointments that seemed to follow me wherever I went. When I walked into that cabin, it felt like I could finally breathe again. It was the one place in the world that was truly mine. But Carl? He had never cared about it. To him, it was just another thing to be sold off when it suited his needs. Another pawn in his endless schemes. And now he had crossed the line. The one place in the world that I felt truly connected to, the one place that had been my anchor, had been ripped away from me in a single sentence. Just like that. "You can't do that." I snapped, my voice shaking with fury. I was angry, more angry than I'd been in a long time. My heart was racing, my hands trembling as the weight of what he had done sunk in. "That cabin was mine, Carl. You don't get to just sell it." He laughed. The sound was obnoxious, a dry, mocking chuckle that made my blood boil. "Relax, Daisy. It's just a building. You've never even been there much, right? What's the point of holding on to it? It's just sitting there. I figured I could clear up some debts this way. You'll thank me one day. I could feel my blood pressure rising, my head spinning with a rush of emotions I couldn't control. The rage was overwhelming, threatening to consume me. I'll thank you when pigs fly, I spat, my words dripping with disdain. I hung up before he could say another word. For a moment I stood there, my phone still pressed to my ear, staring blankly at the clinic's peeling walls. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest that I thought it might explode. The adrenaline coursed through my veins, the anger mingling with disbelief, and a sharp pang of hurt lodged itself deep in my stomach. Carl had crossed a line. He had done something I never thought he would do. But there was something he didn't know. The cabin wasn't entirely mine to sell. My best friend Mia and I co-owned it. And according to the legal agreement we had signed years ago, neither of us could sell it without the other's consent. Carl had made a huge mistake. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I leaned against the clinic wall, my hand still trembling as I stared at the phone in my hand. My mind raced, running through all the options, all the ways I could fight this. There was no way in hell I was going to let Carl get away with this. He had thought he could sell it off without anyone noticing, but he didn't know me. He didn't know what I was capable of when pushed too far. I wasn't going to let him win this time. Not again. As soon as I could, I reached for my phone again. I needed to talk to someone who understood. Someone who could help me make sense of the whirlwind that Carl had just unleashed. My hand shook as I dialed Mia's number, the screen buzzing in my palm. It felt like the only thing that kept me tethered to reality. Mia was my best friend, my confidant, and the co-owner of the cabin that Carl had just sold without a second thought. She had been there with me through thick and thin, and I knew if anyone could help me get through this, it was her. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Daisy? Everything okay? Mia's voice came through immediately, bright and cheerful, unaware of the storm that had just erupted in my life. Carl sold the cabin, I blurted out before I could stop myself. My voice was still shaky from the anger that bubbled up inside me, the heat of betrayal clouding my thoughts. He did it without asking me, without telling me. He just sold it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the quiet clicking of her keyboard, probably trying to make sense of what I had just said. The silence stretched for what felt like a lifetime. Then Mia spoke, her disbelief mirroring mine, her voice sharp and incredulous. What? He sold it? Without your say-so? That's beyond ridiculous. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe, trying to keep the anger in check. My emotions were on the edge of exploding, but I knew I had to stay calm. I had to be logical. I was done letting Carl control me with his lies and manipulation. I had worked too hard to get to this point in my life to let him steal it all away without a fight. I know, I said. My voice steadied despite the storm brewing inside me. He thinks it's just some property to sell and trade, but it's not. We have an agreement, Mia. He didn't have the legal right to sell it. We both signed the co-ownership agreement years ago. This is not his decision to make. He doesn't have the authority to sell it without my consent. I need you to pull up the documents. We're going to take this to court. I could hear the familiar sound of Mia typing in the background. She was always on top of things. And I could feel the sense of relief starting to settle in my chest. At least now I wasn't alone in this fight. Mia had always been my rock, and she would be with me every step of the way. She didn't hesitate for a second, as always. You got it, Daisy, Mia said, her voice firm now, full of determination. Let's make sure he pays for this. I'll get the documents ready, and we'll take the next steps. He's not going to get away with this. Her words hit me like a wave of calm in the midst of the storm. Mia was right. I wasn't going to let Carl get away with this. I had let him push me around for far too long, always letting him take the lead while I stayed in the background. Not this time. This time I had the law on my side. And I wasn't going to let Carl tear apart the one thing that had been mine, the one place that had offered me peace after years of chaos. When I hung up the phone, a strange calm washed over me. It wasn't the kind of calm I expected, one that might come after a big argument or a moment of clarity. This was different. It was a calm that came from knowing I was no longer helpless. I wasn't that scared little girl anymore, hiding in the shadows of Carl's manipulation. I had spent too many years allowing him to pull the strings, but now I was the one holding the reins. And I wasn't about to let him get away with taking something so precious from me without a fight. As I sat there staring out the window of my apartment, The city's skyline stretched out before me like a cold reminder of the world I had been trying to escape. The streets were bustling, alive with people rushing to and from their lives, oblivious to the storm that had just started in my own world. But I was done pretending, done hiding behind my work, done letting Carl's calls knock me off balance. I was going to take action. I stood up abruptly, pacing across the room. I felt the tension in my body, the anxiety bubbling in my chest, but it wasn't the same tension I'd felt earlier. This was different. This was the kind of tension that came before a battle that I was ready to fight. I wasn't going to let Carl's careless actions disrupt my life anymore. I was going to take the cabin back. I was going to make him pay for what he'd done. I grabbed my laptop from the desk, opening it quickly to pull up the co-ownership agreement that Mia and I had signed years ago. We had made sure to have everything in writing back then, knowing that a place like the cabin, with all its sentimental value, could easily be taken from us by someone with the wrong intentions. Carl had never understood how much that cabin meant to me. To him, it was just another asset, something he could liquidate to solve his immediate problems. But to me, it was everything. It was my sanctuary. It was where I went to escape from the world. It was where I could breathe. And now Carl had sold it. I was done letting him make decisions for me. I was done letting him manipulate me into doing what he wanted. The cabin wasn't just some investment for me. It was a part of my past, my history. And he had no right to treat it like an expendable object. I opened the document and scanned through it, reading each clause carefully. I needed to be sure. I needed to know that I had every legal right to fight back. There it was. The co-ownership agreement clearly stated that neither of us, Mia or I, could sell the cabin without the other's consent. It was as clear as day. Carl had broken the law, and now I had the proof I needed. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. For the first time since I had gotten the call, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had a plan, and now it was time to set it into motion. I reached for my phone again, dialing Mia's number. This time, my hands were steady. I was no longer the person I had been when Carl had called. I had a sense of purpose now. Mia picked up after the first ring. "Daisy, did you find it?" she asked, her voice filled with quiet anticipation. "I found it," I replied, my tone more confident than I felt. "We're going to take this to court. Carl has no idea what he's gotten himself into." Mia's voice softened, but there was a certain fierceness to it now. "You're right. He's going to regret this. I'll start pulling together everything we need, and we'll get the legal team involved. He won't stand a chance." I nodded even though Mia couldn't see me. "Let's do this. I'm not letting him get away with it." As I hung up, I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. It wasn't just the anger anymore. It was the realization that I was finally taking control. I wasn't going to let Carl take anything else from me. This time I was going to win. The days that followed felt like a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and emotional roller coasters. Each morning, I would wake up to the harsh reality of what Carl had done. The anger, the frustration, it was a daily companion, gnawing at me as I worked to gather the evidence I needed, every single document, every single call, every conversation with my lawyer. It was exhausting. But I knew I couldn't stop now. This fight wasn't just about a piece of property anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, my boundaries, my peace. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, I returned home. I had imagined this moment so many times before. In my mind, I had expected to feel relief, to walk into the cabin and feel the calm that had once embraced me. The place that had always been my sanctuary, my escape from the madness of the world. I had expected the familiar scent of pine wood, the cozy warmth of the hearth, the comforting creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I had expected the peace to wash over me, to restore the balance I had been missing for so long. But when I opened the door, it was nothing like I had imagined. The silence that greeted me was suffocating. The air felt heavy, thick with emptiness. It wasn't the silence of peace. It wasn't the quiet that came with solitude and rest. It was the hollow silence of something lost, something broken. The cabin, which had once felt like a warm embrace, now felt like a shell that had been stripped of its heart. The walls seemed to close in on me, and for the first time since I had left, I felt the full weight of Carl's betrayal. The walls that had once been filled with memories, family dinners, long weekends with friends, quiet nights by the fire, now felt like mere facades, lifeless and cold. The cabin no longer held any of the warmth or love it once did. It was as though the spirit of the place had been ripped away, leaving only the cold, empty shell behind. I stood there for a moment, taking in the reality of it all. The tears I had been holding back for days threatened to spill over, but I refused to let them. I wasn't going to let Carl see me break. Not now. Not after everything I had already been through. He had taken the cabin from me, but he wasn't going to take my strength. Not again. I had no intention of letting Carl off the hook. Just as I dropped my bags onto the floor, the phone rang. The screen lit up with Carl's name and my heart sank. I didn't want to talk to him. I didn't want to hear his voice, hear the smugness in his tone, the arrogance that had always been a part of him. But I knew I had to answer. This confrontation was inevitable and I wasn't going to shy away from it anymore. I picked up the phone, my finger hovering over the screen for a moment before I swiped to answer. Well, if it isn't Daisy back from saving the world. Carl's voice oozed through the phone, dripping with sarcasm. He had no idea how much I despised that tone, the one he always used when he thought he had the upper hand. It made my skin crawl. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him. Not of his petty words or his games. What do you want, Carl? I didn't bother to pretend I was happy to hear from him. My voice was steady, calm, but underneath there was a quiet storm brewing. He wouldn't get away with this. I just wanted to make sure you're not too upset about the whole cabin situation, he said with an air of smugness, like he was doing me a favor by calling to check in. It's gone now. No point in crying over spilled milk, right? His words hit me like a slap across the face. Gone. As if it was just something he could sell off without any consequences. As if it meant nothing. I clenched my jaw, the anger welling up inside me like a tidal wave ready to crash. Funny you should say that, I replied, my voice colder now, each word calculated. Because as far as I can tell, it's not gone. Mia and I checked the ownership records. You can't sell what doesn't belong to you. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him scrambling for words. I knew I had hit a nerve. I knew he wasn't expecting me to fight back this time. Carl had always underestimated me, thinking that because I was quiet and calm, I would never stand up for myself. But this time, I wasn't going to let him get away with it. That's ridiculous, he spat, his voice faltering for the first time. I could hear the tension in his words, the crack in his confidence. I sold it. It's a done deal. No, I said firmly, the certainty in my voice cutting through his excuses like a knife. You didn't. Mia and I co-owned that cabin. Without her consent, the sale is invalid. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. And Carl could feel it. I could hear the shift in his breathing, the unease that was slowly creeping into his voice. He wasn't used to me standing my ground. He wasn't used to me fighting back. Don't you dare think you can just waltz in and take what's mine, I added, my words sharp, every syllable a challenge. You've done enough damage already, Carl. I'm not going to let you destroy everything I've worked for. I could almost hear him seething on the other end of the line, but I didn't care. This wasn't just about the cabin anymore. This was about me reclaiming my life, my peace, my strength. I had let him control me for too long. I had allowed him to manipulate me, to guilt-trip me, to make me feel small. But not anymore. I wasn't that person anymore. I've had enough of your games, I continued, my voice unwavering. And this time, you're going to face the consequences. Carl didn't respond right away. For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then his voice came through, but it was different, strained, almost defensive. You think you can just push me around like this? He growled. You don't know what it's like to be me. I had no choice. I had debts, Daisy. Real debts. You don't understand what I had to do. I could hear the desperation in his voice now. The cracks in his carefully crafted persona. Carl was trying to manipulate me again, trying to play the victim, but I wasn't buying it anymore. I wasn't going to let him guilt-trip me into feeling sorry for him. Not this time. You made your choices, Carl, I said, my voice low and cold. And now you're going to have to live with them. You crossed a line. And you're not going to get away with it. There was a long pause, and I could hear Carl breathing heavily on the other end. I could feel the tension building. The weight of the confrontation hanging in the air. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I'm done with you, I said, and before he could say another word, I hung up the phone. I stood there for a moment, holding the phone in my hand, feeling the rush of adrenaline course through me. For the first time in a long time, I felt powerful, in control. Carl had thought he could manipulate me into silence, that I would back down and let him win. But he was wrong. This time I was the one calling the shots. I took a deep breath and looked around the cabin, the place that had once been my sanctuary. It felt different now, emptier, colder, but it was still mine. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. Not Carl. Not anyone. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, I felt like I was finally on the right side of it. Mia and I worked tirelessly together, side by side, every night, every morning, gathering the evidence we would need for the legal battle that lay ahead. It was overwhelming at times. The weight of it all. The endless documents to go through, the phone calls with the lawyer, the sleepless nights where my mind raced with thoughts of Carl and his manipulations. I could feel the pressure mounting on me, but there was no way I was backing down. I had fought for too long, sacrificed too much, and this time, Carl was going to face the consequences of his actions. We started by reaching out to the real estate agent Carl had worked with. From the beginning, I knew something didn't sit right. Carl had always been the type to work in the shadows, to avoid transparency and legality whenever it suited him. The agent had been surprisingly cooperative once we explained the situation. And it didn't take long before the truth started to unravel. Carl hadn't followed proper procedures at all. He had tried to pull off the sale under the table, bypassing all the legal steps that were required for such a transaction. No official transfer of ownership had been made, and the paperwork he had provided to the agent was incomplete. Sketchy at best. He hadn't even mentioned Mia's name, the other rightful co-owner of the cabin. Carl had thought he could get away with it, that he could manipulate me from afar, but this time, we had proof, hard evidence that would back up everything we said. I remember the first time we got all the documents lined up, piecing together the narrative of Carl's fraud. Mia was the one who made the connections, who found the missing links in the chain, who pulled the strings together like an expert detective. I was the one providing the emotional backbone, keeping my focus despite the firestorm swirling around us. Together we were unstoppable. This was no longer just about the cabin. It was about reclaiming my life, my strength, my dignity. One night, after a long day of reviewing papers and making phone calls, Mia and I sat in my living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. We had stacks of documents spread out on the coffee table between us, and I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on my shoulders. I was exhausted, physically, emotionally, mentally, but I knew we were close. The finish line was in sight. I looked at Mia, her face tired but determined, her eyes burning with the same fire that I felt inside me. We had come so far, and we weren't about to stop now. I'm not just fighting for the cabin, I told her, my voice steady but laced with emotion. I'm fighting for everything he's stolen from me, the trust, the peace, the years he thought he could walk all over me. This time, I'm not letting him win. Mia nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. This wasn't just about the cabin. It was about the years Carl had taken from me, the years I had spent in his shadow, hiding from my own power. It was about the way he had treated me like I was nothing, like I didn't matter, like my dreams and my peace of mind were inconsequential. But not anymore. This time I was the one in control. This time I was standing up for myself, for my future, for the woman I had become. We'll make sure he pays for this, Mia said, her voice full of resolve. You won't get away with it. We've got the law on our side. And he won't be able to wiggle out of this one. Not this time. The words were simple, but they were everything. They were the affirmation I needed to hear. The reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. Mia had been by my side through every challenge, every setback, and every painful moment of this journey. She was my constant. The one person who had never wavered, who had always believed in me when I had trouble believing in myself. Together, we drafted the cease and desist letter, pouring every ounce of our anger and determination into it. We made sure it was clear Carl was to stop any attempt to sell the cabin, and any further interference would result in legal action. We had all the evidence we needed, and we weren't going to back down. When the letter was sent, I knew there was no turning back. This was it. The fight was on. I could feel my heart pounding as I hit the send button on the email. It wasn't just the fear of what might happen next, it was the weight of the finality. The knowledge that this was no longer a game. Carl was going to have to face the consequences of his actions. He could no longer hide behind his lies and manipulation. The truth was out, and there was nowhere for him to run. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of tension, a kind that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Mia and I continued to gather more evidence, making sure we had everything in place for when we went to court. We spent hours going over every single detail, every nuance of the case. It was grueling, exhausting work, but we both knew it was worth it. I wasn't just fighting for the cabin anymore. I was fighting for my life, for my independence, for my ability to stand tall in the face of everything Carl had done to me. And as we prepared for the legal showdown, I could feel something shift within me. I was no longer that quiet, timid girl who had let Carl walk all over her. I wasn't the woman who had let fear dictate her actions. I had become someone stronger, someone who would not tolerate being manipulated anymore. This time I wasn't backing down. This time I was in control. Carl had thought he could manipulate me again. He had thought that because I had been so passive in the past, I would be passive again. But what he didn't understand was that I wasn't the same person anymore. I had learned, I had grown, and I had found the strength within myself to stand up for what was mine. And now, he was going to face the consequences of his actions. The letter was just the beginning. We were ready for the next step, and no matter how long it took, I knew we would win. We had the law. We had the proof, and most importantly, we had each other. Carl had underestimated me, but now it was time for him to see just how wrong he was. This battle wasn't just for the cabin. It was for everything I had ever lost, everything I had ever given up. And this time I was taking it all back. The final blow came when Carl was officially charged with fraud and theft. I remember standing there, staring at the letter in my hands, my mind struggling to comprehend the gravity of what had just happened. The words on the page seemed almost surreal. It felt as though I had been holding my breath for an eternity, each day spent under the oppressive weight of what Carl had done to me, to the cabin, to my life. But now at last I could exhale. The battle had been long and exhausting, but it had all led to this moment of triumph. Carl had thought he could take everything from me. He had believed that his manipulation, his lies, his sheer arrogance would break me. For so long I had allowed him to shape my life, to dictate my actions, to control the things I cared about. But in the end, it was I who had taken back control. It was I who had fought to the bitter end, who had refused to let him have the last word, who had stood tall and faced him head-on. And now, with the legal system on my side, I had won. The weight of that victory settled in, slowly at first, like a gentle wave washing over me. I had been fighting for so long, for so many years, that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to be free. To know that my choices, my actions, would finally have the consequences they deserved. I could almost feel the anger, the betrayal, the fear, all of it being lifted off my shoulders, piece by piece. It wasn't just about the cabin anymore. Sure, it had started that way, a place that Carl had tried to take from me. A building, a tangible object that had been reduced to a mere pawn in his endless game. But as the legal proceedings moved forward, I realized something crucial. This fight wasn't about a property. It was about me. It was about standing up for myself, reclaiming my space, my power, and my sense of self-worth. It was about refusing to let someone like Carl dictate my life any longer. I stood there in the living room of the cabin, holding the letter in my hands, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to truly look at it, to feel the weight of its significance. The cabin had always been more than just a home to me. It was a symbol of everything I had worked for, the years I had spent building my career, my life, the hard-won peace I had finally achieved after years of struggle. The cabin represented the woman I had become, the one who refused to let anyone take away what was mine. And Carl had tried. He had tried to rip that from me, but in the end, I had held on. As I walked back into the cabin that night, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sent a shiver through me. The place that had once been filled with anger and betrayal, the site of so many painful memories, now felt like a triumph. It felt like a victory, not just over Carl, but over the fear and the doubts that had held me captive for so long. The cabin was no longer a place of hurt. It was a place of strength, of resilience, of redemption. I ran my hand along the wall as I walked through the living room, the walls that had witnessed so many of my moments of despair, the couch that had been my refuge during the darkest days, the mantel above the fireplace where I had once sat, tears streaming down my face, questioning if I would ever find peace again. But now as I stood in that same room, it felt different. The air felt lighter, freer. The weight of the past no longer hung over me like a shadow. I knew that the cabin was mine now, not just in the legal sense, but in every sense of the word. It was where I had rediscovered my strength, where I had learned to fight for what I deserved. And that fight was still ongoing, but the battle had already been won in my heart. I had finally taken control of my life again. And no one, especially not Carl, could take that away from me. That evening, as I stood outside on the porch, the crisp evening air kissed my skin. And the sound of the rustling leaves seemed to echo the calm that had settled in my heart. I looked out over the mountains, the colors of the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Mia joined me on the porch, and we stood there in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The moment felt sacred, like we were witnessing something beautiful and transformative. Mia smiled beside me, her eyes reflecting the peace that I had found in this place in myself. "We did it," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet pride. I nodded, the weight of those words sinking in. Yes, we did. We fought for it. For me. We stood there for a few more moments, taking in the view, breathing in the fresh air, letting everything settle around us. The stress, the anxiety, the anger, it all felt so distant now. I had fought for this peace, and I had finally found it. And in that moment I realized something profound. It wasn't just the cabin that had been restored. It was me. I had been broken, yes, but now I was whole again. When I looked back at Mia, I saw the same realization in her eyes. She had been with me every step of the way, through the darkest days and the brightest victories. She had been my anchor, my guide, and now she was there with me, celebrating the calm after the storm. "This isn't just about the cabin," I said softly, the words coming easily now, as if I had been holding them back for so long. "It's about me finding my way back to who I am, who I was always meant to be." Mia's smile deepened, and she placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch warm and reassuring. "And you did. You found your peace. You found your strength. That's what matters most." As the last light of the day faded behind the mountains, I stood there with Mia, feeling the weight of everything we had gone through. The pain, the betrayal, the uncertainty. It had all led to this moment. I had fought hard, but the victory wasn't just about defeating Carl. It was about reclaiming everything I had lost in the process: myself, my sense of identity, my inner peace. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly at home, not just in the cabin, but in my own life. I had fought for my future, and now I was free. Free from the past, free from Carl's manipulation, and free to live my life the way I had always dreamed. As I sat down on the porch with Mia, watching the stars begin to twinkle above us, I realized that the battle had made me stronger. I had become the person I was always meant to be, and no one could take that away from me. Not ever again.